All right, thank you all, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me to speak. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel today and speak to you a little bit about the work we've been doing with the Focused Ultrasound Foundation and in general. So KI Research is a contract clinical research organization that's been in business for about 30 years. We've been helping federal government within the NIH, CDC, Department of Defense, as well as private companies, drug companies, device companies, as well as foundations such as the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. We've got 30 years of experience providing a real wide variety of services to our clients, but most of it is very deeply rooted in the core fundamentals of data element development, database design, and ensuring that all that we're doing is of the highest quality and rigor in order to be able to submit when necessary for regulatory approval or otherwise. We've been working with the Focused Ultrasound Foundation now for about 5 years. We've supported a variety of initiatives directly for the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, as well as some of their investigator-initiated studies, and we're very pleased to be partnering to bring forward a registry that you'll hear more about a little bit this morning. A little bit more on the services overview for KI. We engage with our clients in a very collaborative process early on. We like to talk with folks as they're just beginning to think about how they're going to begin their clinical trials, from protocol design through database design, data element capture, and so forth. So we offer some clinical research consulting services to allow that initial stage of development to proceed. We also do full-service clinical trial management as well, so we can help engage with the investigators in identifying sites, implementing their studies, training, all of the electronic data capture on through to submission. In addition, we have operated over a 30-year history as a data coordinating center for many U.S. government entities, as well as private companies and foundations, again, given our very strong data management core, which is rooted in a lot of our expertise. Initially started with the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, where we were responsible for helping to identify the set of common data elements that were used for a lot of the clinical research being conducted in that institute. We now apply that methodology as we're working with the NIAMS, a lot of our other studies within the NIA, and providing consultation within a lot of other NIH institutes and for any other project we do. So we embody that core or fundamental approach to all that we do in data capture and collection to ensure that we're doing the most rigorous and quality controlled process and methodology. And we've got a bit of experience in a wide variety of therapeutic areas. We frankly, in our 30-year history, have kind of seen it all, but we do focus specifically in neurology, central nervous system disorders, psychiatry, mental health, infectious diseases, a bit in oncology, particularly where it concerns data elements, and largely because of our work with the CADSR initiative to look at common data elements and data harmonization across different systems for a lot of the oncology studies that are being conducted and funded through NCI. So again, we've worked with a lot of different areas: drugs, drug-device combos, devices alone, and we have a specialty in working with both geriatric and pediatric populations. So this is a nice segue. We heard from the FDA folks earlier today, and just to reiterate this, striking this balance of obtaining data early on in a process and also after a particular device or intervention has been approved is so important for us to really ensure that we're getting the most high quality, safe, and effective technologies to improve health and quality of life, as recently, again, espoused by Jeff Shuren, who's the director for the FDA's CDRH. So I want to talk a little bit more about types of studies. You heard a little bit about this earlier today. The feasibility studies, which are really intended early in the process to begin looking at a small subset of patients, generally not statistically driven, typically between 1 and 40 subjects, just to start building and amassing that data to be able to allow refinement to what's required to develop that device and for future study. Then we move into the pivotal studies, which we'll talk about a variety of different designs, and that's intended to provide that primary data that's really needed for future regulatory support. That's predominantly focused on looking at the safety, efficacy, and study design, and it is very highly regulated and statistically driven. Then we also move into the post-market studies as well as registries, which actually can be designed and developed throughout the life of any type of device or intervention. It's often required as a condition of approval, at least in the US, and also may be required for reimbursement process. And as we heard this morning, there can be some issues with how much data is needed over what period of time and what kinds of data. And that's also why it's so very important, as they mentioned, to have those conversations early in the process if that data is to be used from a regulatory standpoint. So gathering that longer-term data is very important for really understanding the real-world use of those interventions that are being designed. So specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about different designs. This is a very high-level overview and just intended to give you a sampling. I'm happy to talk with anybody after the session today if you'd like a little bit more information, and also point you to some good resources. Randomized clinical trials are really the gold standard and what's generally required for doing that quantitative, comparative controlled experiment to really look at two or more interventions, very often looking at the comparison of a particular standard of care, which in some cases may be no intervention at all, or placebo, as compared with whatever the drug or device of study is intended to look at. Benefits are that it's extremely rigorous, that it removes as many sources of bias as possible in the process, and it's really essential and necessary for that regulatory approval pathway. Some challenges that can happen with those trials are they can be very costly and timely, a long time to complete. There is an effectiveness gap that reflects the difference between the treatment health effects in randomized clinical trials and the real world effect. And that may in some ways stall some innovation. It's not as rapid as I think we would all like in terms of trying to get to really understanding how that device or intervention can be used in a particular population. And it may also really be limited in the questions it's actually answering. So while randomized controlled clinical trials are also used as a method of comparative effectiveness research, there also are a variety of ways you can look at those interventions as compared with other interventions in a real-world setting, looking at more heterogeneous populations, looking at, practically speaking, and from a pragmatic standpoint, how those interventions are really going to be used in a population in different environments, in different age ranges, and across different populations. That can be, again, through the use of randomized trials or through observational studies, but again, can also be fairly lengthy, long, and costly in time and process to complete, but they are, again, also often essential to that regulatory approval process. That's where we come to sort of the next wave of interest in looking at what we call adaptive and platform clinical trials, which can be used either alone or together, where you're testing several therapies in multiple treatment arms, and you're often comparing to one common control arm. That would be a platform-based trial where you're looking at a lot of different interventions. The goal with the adaptive design is to really begin looking at the start of what you might want to address in terms of the design of that study after you've accumulated or amassed a certain amount of data. So with adaptive trials, you're really using a series of planned modifications to increase that trial efficiency, to be able to hopefully decrease the number of patients you're looking at, and look at the potential design elements that you might be able to change throughout the process, which might include anything from how you're randomizing to dropping different arms of the trial, really looking at seamless transition from a phase 2 to a phase 3 trial. And they, again, can be used alone or in combination with one another. So the benefits of this are that they can be really flexible and allow you to be more effective, cost-effective, and timely in amassing the amount of data that you need to really understand what's going on with those interventions and eliminate less effective treatments more earlier in that process. Some challenges are the complex design elements, statistical considerations. There's a Bayesian statistics methodology that's often applied to these adaptive trials, which is something that's a bit more specialized analysis is required, and they're not necessarily widely understood. So it's something that does require some degree of consultation in order to implement those types of trials. So the last area I'll come to is registries. So these can be used, registries are not all created equal. They are using observational study methods to collect data in a uniform manner, and it could be clinical data or other data as well, including patient-reported outcomes or other types of information regarding an intervention, specifications of the devices being used, or other types of data that might be collected. And it's really used to evaluate specified outcomes for a population which is defined by a particular disease, condition, or exposure. And this can be used, these registries can be used for a variety of different purposes, for also in some cases for regulatory purposes, to amass that data, to address certain scientific questions or clinical questions, to address policy issues, perhaps reimbursement issues, or simply to understand what is the state of the art, if you will, in terms of who's doing what types of interventions in what ways, as we'll hear about later regarding some of the registries we're working on. So it's really meant to inform the natural history of a condition or disease, perhaps to look at quality of outcomes, can be further used in some cases to measure and monitor safety, determine effectiveness or cost effectiveness of treatments, which generally the other types of studies are not looking at the cost of the study specifically, or the cost of the intervention that's being applied, and also can be used to collect a really much broader range of data elements than you would want to put into a randomized controlled trial, for example. Challenges that can occur with doing registries are, recruiting physicians with competing priorities. Maintaining long-term patient follow-up can be a challenge, which is why support in those areas and really thinking through on the front end what your design elements need to be and how you're going to engage. If you are in fact including patient-related reported outcomes, for example, in your registries. And also making sure that you're aware of the fact that if you're only looking at one type of intervention, what kind of bias you might have in terms of focusing on one specified treatment. And actually, as we look through the considerations for setting up a registry, which we'll talk specifically, Dr. Wong from Stanford will talk specifically about the pancreatic cancer registry, but some considerations in general for any registry up front, you really want to think through are what are you defining as that scope and goal, and what your developed study plan or protocol is going to be. Very important based on those goals to identify who is the set of stakeholders that you really need to be having involved in that early design process, and serve as a scientific advisory committee to make sure that you're accounting for the different perspectives that would be necessary in the design. So establishing that multidisciplined registry team early is important. In our case at KI Research, we're a very active part of that design team because we take into account things about the way the data should be collected, standardization of information, common data elements that could be reused from one registry or study to another, even if they're for different indications. So we really help to think through those things in advance. Also very important is the governance structure as mentioned with those stakeholders, as well as early on really trying to look at what the feasibility and sustainability of those registries can be. Also mentioned a little bit about the physician and patient recruitment. Very important to think about that up front, depending on the goal of your registry, how you're going to engage those different stakeholders throughout the process. So I'm going to pass it over to John McElwain from Velos in a moment to speak a little bit more to the elements of registry platform, what you have to consider up front from a core data element perspective, considerations of various data sources and reporting of data visualization. These are all things that my team at KI Research is actively involved in, but it's very important to have an excellent partner from a platform perspective who also really understands those challenges of things that need to be considered up front. So with that, I will pause and pass it on to John.